My husband threw divorce papers at me during a live stream to impress his investors. He told the camera I had 48 hours to vacate Blackwood Manor to make room for his new girlfriend. Preston thinks he is evicting a helpless housewife, but he never read the fine print of our marriage contract. He does not own this estate. I do. And he just broadcasted his own destruction to the entire world. My name is Julianne Vance. I am 34 years old, and I have spent my entire adult life distinguishing between authentic masterpieces and worthless forgeries. As a professional art appraiser and restoration expert, I am trained to see the cracks beneath the varnish that others miss. I was standing in the main foyer of Blackwood Manor in Connecticut, the home my family has held for generations, when the heavy oak doors burst open. My husband, Preston Vance, strode in with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. He was not alone. Clinging to his arm was a woman who looked about 28, dressed in sharp, modern clothing that screamed Silicon Valley money. This was Sienna Cross, the woman Preston had been bragging about for weeks, introducing her to his colleagues as a venture capital genius who was going to revolutionize his business. What caught my attention immediately was not the woman, but the phone in Preston's hand. He was holding it up, broadcasting live to his network of investors. I could hear his voice booming off the stone walls, explaining that today marked a historic merger of assets between his real estate firm and Sienna's tech fund. He walked right up to where I stood by the console table, the camera lens fixed on my face. Without missing a beat in his sales pitch, Preston pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket and threw it onto the surface of the 18th century mahogany table. The slap of the paper against the wood was sharp and final. He announced to the thousands of people watching that those were divorce papers. He looked into the camera and declared that I had 48 hours to vacate the premises. He told his audience that Sienna, the true partner he deserved, needed this space to set up her operations for their upcoming super project. The humiliation was calculated and precise. Preston told the world that I had contributed nothing to his success, that I was merely a decorative housewife who no longer fit the caliber of the lifestyle he was ascending to. He said I was obsolete. Sienna stepped forward then, playing her part perfectly. She offered me a sad, patronizing smile and told me she was sorry it had to come to this, but progress required sacrifice. Her voice was soft, but her eyes were hard. I watched her gaze drift over my shoulder, hungry and calculating, as she assessed the oil paintings and the antique tapestries lining the hall. She was not looking at art, she was looking at inventory. I did not cry. I did not scream or beg him to reconsider. I simply smoothed the cuffs of my blouse and looked directly into the camera lens. I offered a small, calm smile, the kind a mother gives a child who has just made a foolish mistake. I saw the comments on his screen scrolling faster, viewers asking why I was so composed, why I was not breaking down. My silence seemed to unnerve them more than a scream would have. Preston, oblivious to the mood shift, delivered his ultimatum. He told me I was allowed to take my personal clothing and toiletries, but nothing else. He stated that every piece of furniture, every painting, and every rug in the manor was now considered joint property, assets he was transferring to Sienna's fund to leverage for their loans. As Sienna reached up to adjust her hair, the light from the chandelier caught her wrist. She was wearing a Patek Philippe watch. To the untrained eye, it was a symbol of immense wealth. But I saw the way the light hit the bezel and the slight unevenness in the spacing of the dial. It was a fake, a high-quality replica, but a fake nonetheless. My professional instinct kicked in immediately. If her watch was a lie, what else about her was fabricated? Preston thought he was discarding a useless wife to upgrade his life. He believed he was the master of this estate, generously giving me 2 days to leave his kingdom. But as he turned back to the camera to sign off, a cold satisfaction settled in my chest. He had been so arrogant 5 years ago, so sure of his financial superiority, that he had never bothered to read the fine print of our marriage contract or the deed to this house. He did not know that Blackwood Manor was not just a building, it was a legal fortress, and I held the only key. He had just documented his own demise, and he had no idea the trap was already snapping shut. 7 years ago, Preston was a junior broker with cheap suits and an ambition that radiated off him like heat waves from hot asphalt. I was 27, the quiet heiress of the Blackwood line, a family that believed true power was never having to raise your voice. Preston looked at me and saw a soft target, a girl with a famous last name and a hobby involving dusty canvases. He never respected my work as a restoration expert. To him, it was just playing with paint while he built real value in steel and glass. That condescension was the reason he was currently walking into a buzzsaw without even knowing it. The fundamental mistake Preston made was assuming Blackwood Manor was a standard piece of real estate. It is not. The manor is the primary asset of the Blackwood Heritage Preservation Trust. I am not the owner in the traditional sense. I am the sole lifetime trustee and guardian. The ironclad bylaws of the trust state that the property can never be sold, transferred, liened, mortgaged, or considered marital property under any jurisdiction. When we signed our prenuptial agreement 5 years ago, Preston's lawyers were so obsessed with protecting his future millions that they skimmed right over the section regarding my assets. Preston signed the document without reading page 42 because he was absolutely convinced he would always be the richer one. I walked up the grand staircase to the master bedroom, ostensibly to pack my life into boxes as he had commanded. In reality, I was there to access the security mainframe. I opened my laptop and activated the internal surveillance grid. This system was designed to protect Rembrandts and Vermeers, but today it was capturing a different kind of liability. I put on my headphones and the audio feed from the library downstairs flooded in. Preston sounded frantic. He was telling Sienna that the shadow bank needed the property deed by Monday morning to approve the collateralization. They were trying to secure a hard money loan of $5 million to fund what they called the Series A capital round for her company, Nebula Ventures. The picture was becoming crystal clear. The luxury housing market had frozen solid over the last 6 months, and Preston was leveraging everything he had to stay afloat. He was drowning in debt, and he saw Sienna as his life raft. He needed my home to pay for his ticket to safety. As I listened to them plot to mortgage a house they did not own, I walked over to the luggage rack where the maid had placed Sienna's bags. My eyes landed on her handbag, a Himalayan crocodile Hermes Birkin that would retail for over $200,000. It was convincing, visually stunning even, but my fingers knew better. I ran my thumb along the stitching of the handle. It was machine perfect, too perfect. The hand stitching of a genuine artisan has a specific tension and angle that a machine cannot replicate, and the spacing here was off by exactly 1 millimeter. It was a super fake. First the watch, now the bag. The woman downstairs was a walking counterfeit. I picked up my phone and dialed Harrison, the attorney who had protected the Blackwood interests for 40 years. He answered on the second ring. I explained that Preston had attempted to evict the trustee and was currently conspiring to commit mortgage fraud using trust assets. Harrison was furious, immediately suggesting we have the sheriff remove them for trespassing. I stopped him. If we kicked them out now, Preston would claim it was a domestic dispute and drag it out in family court. I needed absolute destruction. I told Harrison to wait. We would let them think they had won. We would let them host their party and sign their papers. We would let them walk all the way to the edge of the cliff before we turned on the lights. I sat at my desk in the west wing, the glow of 3 monitors illuminating the darkened room. While Preston and his girlfriend celebrated their victory downstairs, I was dissecting their entire existence. I opened an encrypted chat window and typed a message to Marcus. Marcus was an old friend from my university days who had pivoted from art history to cybersecurity, a man who could find a digital footprint in a desert. I sent him the link to Nebula Ventures and a screenshot of Sienna's face from the live stream. 10 minutes later, Marcus was typing back with a speed that suggested he was just as offended by the amateur nature of this con as I was. He pulled the metadata for the Nebula Ventures website. To the casual observer, it looked like a legitimate, high-end investment portal, complete with press releases and stock tickers. However, The domain registration told the truth. The site had been created exactly 3 months ago. It was a shell, a digital facade held together by stock footage and buzzwords. I zoomed in on the team page. There was a photo of Sienna shaking hands with a famous tech billionaire at a gala. It looked impressive, but my eyes immediately went to the shadows. The lighting on Sienna's face came from the left, while the lighting on the billionaire came from the right. I ran the image through an error-level analysis tool, and the result was a bright map of inconsistencies. It was a composite image, generated by artificial intelligence and refined with Photoshop. The woman had never met these people. She had simply inserted herself into their world. Marcus then hit the jackpot. Facial recognition software matched Sienna's features not to a Silicon Valley executive, but to a mugshot from Florida. Her real name was Sarah Miller. 4 years ago, she had been a mid-level distributor for a multi-level marketing pyramid scheme involving essential oils. She had been sued in small claims court multiple times for petty fraud and failing to deliver inventory. She was not a venture capitalist. She was a failed salesperson who had decided to upgrade her grift. While the data downloaded, I logged into the bank account Preston and I shared, the one intended for our future children's education. My stomach turned. A transfer of $200,000 had been authorized yesterday. Preston had labeled the transaction as investment appraisal fees. He had stolen nearly $250,000 from our family to pay an entry fee into a scam that did not exist. I needed to know I was not the only one. I took the name Sarah Miller and the alias Sienna Cross and ran them through a private forum dedicated to warning high-net-worth individuals about romance scams. The hits appeared almost instantly. I found a thread started by a plastic surgeon in California who had lost $500,000 to a woman matching Sarah's description. Then I found a restaurant chain owner in Texas who had been left with nothing but a fake business plan for a virtual reality dining experience. The pattern was identical in every case. She targeted men who were wealthy but emotionally vulnerable, men going through midlife crises or financial rough patches. She promised them a way out, a chance to be a tech visionary, and then she bled them dry. A loud thud from the floor below broke my concentration. I switched my monitor back to the internal camera feed. My blood ran cold. Preston and Sienna were walking through the drawing room with pads of yellow sticky notes. I watched as Preston slapped a yellow tag onto a Ming Dynasty vase that my grandmother had brought back from Asia in the 1950s. Sienna was pointing at the velvet armchair, laughing as she stuck a price tag on the fabric. They were cataloging my family history for a fire sale. They were treating the legacy of the Blackwood family like items at a garage sale. That vase survived 2 wars, but it might not survive Preston's stupidity. The cold detachment I had felt earlier began to heat up into a focused, dangerous resolve. Protecting the house was no longer enough. Simply kicking them out was too kind. I looked at the faces of the other victims on my screen, men who had been ruined by this woman. I realized I had the resources to do what they could not. I was going to expand the scope of this game. I would not just survive this. I was going to expose the entire operation and bury them under the weight of their own lies. I sat alone in the darkened study, the light from my laptop screen casting long shadows across the room. I drafted a carefully worded, encrypted email to the 2 men I had identified as previous victims. I introduced myself not as a fellow victim, but as a woman currently standing on the precipice they had already fallen over. I hit send and waited. The response from Dr. Eris Thorne came within minutes. It was a frantic, disjointed message that broke my heart. He confessed that he had lost $500,000 to Sienna's fictitious medical artificial intelligence project. The shame was consuming him. He admitted that he was contemplating ending his own life because he could not face his family. Reading his words, I felt a surge of protective anger. This was not just about money anymore. Sienna was destroying lives. Shortly after, Lucas DeRossi replied. He was an interior designer who had been commissioned by Sienna, using a different alias, to design a virtual eco-resort. He had worked for months without pay and had even put down a deposit for materials that she had vanished with. He was furious and ready for blood. I convened a secure video conference call right then and there. When their faces appeared on my screen, the reality of the situation hit me. Doctor. Thorne looked gaunt and exhausted, sitting in a dimly lit office. Lucas looked younger but had the hardened expression of someone who had been humiliated. I took the lead, keeping my voice steady and professional to anchor them. We were no longer isolated targets. We were a team. Together. We dissected the anatomy of the scam. Sienna followed a precise script. She demanded that her partners prove their financial commitment by leveraging a major asset for what she called capital matching. She would claim that to unlock her millions in venture funding, the partner needed to show liquid capital. In reality, she was pushing them to take out high-interest loans from predatory lenders using their homes or businesses as collateral. Once the loan money hit their accounts, she would transfer it to offshore shells and disappear, leaving the men with the massive debt. As we spoke, a notification popped up on my banking alert system. I opened the file and froze. It was a preliminary mortgage application sent to a shadow bank, a lender known for asking few questions. At the bottom of the document was my signature. It was a clumsy forgery, likely traced from an old birthday card, but it was there. Preston had committed a felony. He had forged my name on a federal lending document to mortgage a property he did not own. This was mortgage fraud and identity theft. Just as the weight of that crime settled in my mind, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text message from Preston. I picked it up and read his words. He told me not to make this difficult. He said that if I left quietly without causing a scene, he would provide me with an allowance of $2,000 a month for 1 year. I stared at the screen, incredulous. He was stealing my family legacy, committing felonies in my name, and he thought he could buy my silence with $2,000 a month. The sheer audacity of it crystallized my resolve. I showed the text to Aris and Lucas on the screen. I saw Aris straighten up in his chair, his despair replaced by indignation. Lucas cracked his knuckles. I told them the plan. Tomorrow night, Preston and Sienna were hosting a gala at Blackwood Manor to launch their fraudulent fund. They wanted an audience. They wanted a spectacle to dazzle their investors. We were going to give them one. The party would not be a celebration. It would be an execution of their lies. I promised Aris and Lucas that by the time the sun rose on Sunday, they would have their justice. I ended the call and looked at the forged signature one last time. Preston had just handed me the weapon I needed to bury him. The transformation of Blackwood Manor began exactly 24 hours before my eviction deadline. Preston had hired a trendy event planning crew to strip the house of its soul. They called the aesthetic tech minimalist. I stood on the second-floor landing and watched as they draped heavy, crude white linen over the oil paintings my great-grandfather had commissioned. They rolled up the antique Persian rugs and replaced them with sterile, battery-operated LED light strips that cast a harsh, clinical glow against the wood paneling. They were turning a home with 3 centuries of history into something that resembled a pop-up store for cell phones. It was a visual assault, a desperate attempt to sanitize the past to make room for a hollow future. I retreated to my study in the West Wing to continue my preparations. To anyone looking in, it appeared I was finally surrendering, organizing my life into cardboard boxes to be hauled away. But the stacks of paper on my desk were not personal letters or sentimental keepsakes. They were bank statements, property deeds, and the criminal dossier on Sarah Miller. The laser printer hummed rhythmically in the corner, churning out the ammunition for the war I was about to start. The heavy oak door pushed open without a knock. Sienna sauntered in, a glass of champagne already in her hand despite it being barely noon. She looked around the room with a sneer, her eyes landing on a small, intricate figurine on the mantelpiece. It was a 16th century bronze, heavily insured and irreplaceable. She picked it up carelessly, tossing it slightly in her hand like it was a cheap toy. She laughed and told me that this place was full of outdated trash and that she could not wait to gut this room specifically to make space for her yoga studio. I did not look up from my sorting. I simply told her to be careful. I informed her that if she dropped that piece, she would owe the Blackwood Heritage Preservation Trust a sum larger than the total value of her existence. I spoke with a flat, bored delivery that seemed to irritate her more than anger would have. Sienna scoffed, setting the bronze back down with a dangerous clatter. She told me I was pathetic, inventing stories about trusts and heritage because I was jealous she was taking my life. She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving the scent of expensive, cloying perfume in the air. She truly believed she was the victor. An hour later, Preston stormed in. He was sweating, his tie already loosened, and he smelled of stress. He slapped a document onto my desk. It was a waiver of residence, a legal instrument declaring that I voluntarily forfeited my right to live in the manor effective immediately. He needed it signed before the gala began so he could show his investors he had total control of the asset. He uncapped a gold pen and held it out to me, his hand shaking slightly. I took the pen. I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the panic behind his eyes. I signed my name on the dotted line, but I did not use my standard legal signature. I added a tiny, almost imperceptible loop to the final letter, a variation I had registered with my lawyers years ago to indicate a signature made under duress. To Preston, it looked like compliance. To a judge, it was evidence of coercion. By evening, the driveway was filling with luxury sedans. The guests were arriving, a mix of legitimate investors and opportunistic sharks Preston was trying to lure into Sienna's web. I sat in the dark, watching the security feed on my monitor. The main hall was loud and bright, but my eyes were on the camera in Preston's private office down the hall. The door opened, and Sienna slipped inside. She was not there to work. I watched as she pulled out her phone and zoomed in on the keypad of Preston's wall safe. She snapped 3 quick photos of the wear patterns on the buttons to deduce his combination. Preston was downstairs shaking hands, thinking he and Sienna were partners conquering the world together. He had no idea that to her, he was just another carcass to be picked clean. The gala was a masterpiece of superficiality. The air smelled of expensive cologne and desperate greed. Waiters circulated with trays of crystal flutes, while the room buzzed with the manic energy of people convinced they were about to become billionaires. I could hear snatches of conversation drifting above the music, men in tuxedos promising returns of 200%, and speaking of Nebula Ventures as if it were the next global tech giant. They were drinking the champagne I had bought for our anniversary 3 years ago, celebrating a future that did not exist. I descended the grand staircase. I was supposed to be gone, vanishing into the night like a shameful secret with my suitcase in hand. Instead, I wore a floor-length emerald silk gown that had belonged to my grandmother, paired with the Blackwood sapphire necklace, a piece of jewelry worth more than the entire illusion Preston was trying to sell. The heavy stones felt cold against my skin, a grounding weight. As I reached the bottom step, the chatter nearest to me died down. Heads turned. The investors did not see a discarded wife. They saw the living embodiment of the Blackwood legacy, the old money that gave this building its legitimacy. Preston saw me and his face drained of color. He abandoned a conversation with a banking executive and marched over, grabbing my elbow and steering me into the shadows of an alcove near the library. He hissed at me, demanding to know what the hell I was doing there. He reminded me through gritted teeth that he had told me to leave hours ago and that I was ruining his night. I pulled my arm free from his grip and smoothed the silk of my sleeve. I looked him in the eye and told him that the clock had not yet struck midnight. Technically and legally, I was still the mistress of this house, and I had decided to be a gracious hostess for his little gathering. I walked past him before he could respond, stepping directly into the center of the room. A group of potential investors, men who knew the history of Connecticut real estate better than Preston did, immediately surrounded me. They were curious. They assumed that if I was present, the Blackwood family was fully backing this venture. Their false sense of security was exactly what I needed to dismantle. Sienna sensed the shift in attention. She rushed to the small stage that had been erected in front of the fireplace, tapping a microphone to drown out the murmurs. She launched into her keynote presentation titled The Future of Virtual Real Estate. Behind her, a massive screen projected slides filled with nonsensical buzzwords like synergistic blockchain integration and hypergrowth paradigms. The graphs showed profit lines going straight up at a 90-degree angle, a statistical impossibility that would have been laughable if the audience was not so blinded by greed. While she spoke about monetizing the metaverse, I moved through the crowd like a ghost, planting seeds of destruction. I stopped by a hedge fund manager from New York and casually asked if he had seen the zoning permits for the virtual server farms Sienna was mentioning. I whispered to a real estate tycoon that it was fascinating how they managed to bypass the historic preservation laws that usually restricted this property. I wondered aloud to a banker if the collateral for the Series A round had been fully audited yet. The questions were innocent, but they were designed to trigger the survival instincts of wealthy men. I watched as the mood in the room began to curdle. The hedge fund manager frowned and pulled out his phone, likely to text his legal team. The tycoon narrowed his eyes at the stage, suddenly seeing the cheap fabric covering the paintings not as modern art, but as a cover-up. When the presentation ended and the lights came up, the applause was polite but hesitant. A few of the seasoned investors cornered Preston near the bar. I watched from a distance as they started asking about the land deeds and the specific language of the trust structure. Preston's smile faltered. He dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. He was beginning to sweat, and the temperature in the room had nothing to do with it. The facade was cracking, and I was just pouring another glass of champagne to watch it fall. Beyond the heavy iron gates of the estate, the cavalry had arrived. My phone vibrated against my thigh with a single sharp pulse. It was the signal from Marcus indicating that the projection system in the ballroom had been hijacked and was ready for my command. But more importantly, it meant that Dr. Eris Thorne and Lucas DeRossi were positioned at the perimeter, flanked by a private investigator and 2 agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Because Sienna's schemes involved wire fraud across state lines, this was no longer a civil dispute. It was a federal operation. I stood outside the heavy oak doors of Preston's private study. Through the wood, I could hear the frantic pitch of his voice. He had dragged Sienna in there away from the prying eyes of the skeptical investors. I pressed my ear briefly to the panel. Preston was demanding proof. He was shouting that the men outside were asking questions he could not answer, and he needed to see the confirmation of the $5 million she had promised to transfer into their joint account. Sienna's voice was higher than usual, stripped of its smooth, confident veneer. She was stammering excuses about a technical glitch with the Swiss banking interface. She claimed the international compliance servers were down and that the only way to manually override the freeze and unlock the capital was to show immediate liquidity. I heard the slap of paper against the leather desktop. She was pushing a document in front of him, a power of attorney that would authorize the emergency sale of Blackwood Manor to a holding company she controlled. She told him to sign it immediately if he wanted to save the deal. I opened the door and stepped inside, closing it firmly behind me. The lock clicked into place with a sound of finality. Preston was hunched over the desk, the gold fountain pen hovering over the signature line. He was trembling, caught between the terror of failure and the intoxication of potential wealth. I told him not to sign that paper. I kept my voice low and steady. I warned him that if the pen touched that paper, he would be committing felony fraud by attempting to sell a property that did not belong to him. Preston whipped his head around, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He roared at me to be quiet. He accused me of trying to sabotage him out of spite. He screamed that I was just jealous because he was moments away from becoming richer than my family had ever been. He truly believed, even in this extremity, that he was the hero of this story. I did not argue. I walked past him and threw the heavy manila folder I had been carrying onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud right on top of the fraudulent deed. The papers spilled out across the mahogany surface. The top document was not a financial report. It was an active arrest warrant from the state of Florida. Beside it lay a mugshot taken 4 years ago. The The woman in the photograph had less makeup and bad hair, but the cold, predatory eyes were identical to the woman standing in the room. Under the photo, the name Sarah Miller was printed in block letters. Next to the warrant was a bank statement I had obtained through Marcus, showing the accounts of Nebula Ventures. There were no millions of dollars. There was zero balance, except for the $200,000 Preston had wired yesterday. Preston stared at the mugshot. He looked at the name Sarah Miller. Then he looked up at Sienna. He looked back down at the empty bank statement. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogance drained out of him, replaced by the hollow, crushing realization that he had destroyed his life for a phantom. Sienna saw the shift in his eyes. She knew instantly that the charade was over. The mask of the sophisticated Silicon Valley genius dropped away, revealing something hard and desperate beneath. She realized she could not talk her way out of this. Her hand shot out and grabbed the heavy silver letter opener from the desk. She gripped the handle tightly, the sharp blade catching the light, her body tensing like a cornered animal ready to strike. Sienna lunged across the desk, her fingers clawing for the damning file I had thrown down. I had anticipated her desperation, so I was faster. I swept the papers off the mahogany surface and stepped back, placing the heavy leather executive chair between us as a shield. Her nails scratched uselessly against the air, her face twisted into a mask of pure animalistic rage. She looked nothing like the composed businesswoman from the magazine covers. She looked like a cornered predator. Preston was still standing by the window, his body trembling. He looked at the mugshot on the floor, then up at the woman he intended to marry. He stammered, his voice cracking as he begged her to tell him it was a lie. He pleaded with her to say that I had fabricated the documents to hurt him. He looked so small in that moment, a man clinging to a fantasy that had already evaporated. Sienna threw her head back and laughed, a sound that was devoid of any warmth or humanity. She looked at him with absolute contempt. She told him he was the biggest idiot she had ever met. She screamed that he was useless to her if he did not even own the house. The venom in her voice made him flinch physically, as if she had struck him. Suddenly, a roar erupted from the ballroom outside. It was not the polite applause of impressed investors. It was the sound of shock, anger, and confusion. The vibration of hundreds of voices shouting at once shook the glass panes of the study doors. I glanced toward the hallway. Marcus had done his job. The mood in the house had shifted instantly from celebration to riot. Through the open door, I could see the massive LED screen in the main hall. The slide regarding blockchain synergy was gone. In its place was a high-definition flowchart detailing the structure of the Ponzi scheme Sarah Miller had been running for years. But then, the image shifted to something far more personal and devastating for my husband. A grainy black-and-white video began to play on a loop. It was footage from the hidden camera in my office, recorded 3 nights ago. It showed Preston sitting at my desk, sweating under a desk lamp, practicing my signature over and over again on a sheet of tracing paper. The guests outside were in an uproar. I heard the distinct sound of a glass shattering against a wall. The investors realized they were not standing in a gold mine. They were standing in a crime scene. The booing grew louder, a wave of hostility crashing against the stage. Sienna realized the game was truly over. The money was gone, her cover was blown, and the crowd outside was ready to tear them apart. She turned to Preston, who was still staring blankly at the chaos, and shoved him hard against the bookshelf. Heavy encyclopedias tumbled down, hitting him on the shoulder, but he barely reacted. She did not look back. She kicked off her high heels and bolted toward the side service door that led to the garage, desperate to find a way out before the net closed. Preston tried to chase after her. He took 2 steps, shouting her name, but his legs gave out under the weight of his shock. He tripped over his own feet and crashed face first onto the Persian rug. He tried to scramble up, but he slipped again, sprawling on the floor in a heap of expensive suit fabric and utter failure. He looked pathetic, a man who had reached for the sun and fallen into the mud. I did not run. I did not hide. I smoothed the silk of my emerald gown and walked calmly out of the study and into the main hall. The crowd parted for me, their anger momentarily silenced by my presence. I walked up the steps to the small stage, stepping over the broken glass of a champagne flute. I picked up the microphone that Sienna had dropped in her haste. My voice boomed through the speakers, steady and cold. I apologized to the ladies and gentlemen for the interruption. I told them that what they had just witnessed was a live, practical demonstration of the risks associated with unverified investments. As the last word left my lips, the heavy double doors at the front entrance burst open with a deafening crash. The red and blue lights from the driveway cut through the interior mood lighting. A dozen agents in windbreakers emblazoned with the letters FBI poured into the foyer, their weapons drawn, shouting commands that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The trap had snapped shut. Sienna did not make it far. I knew exactly where she was heading because there was only one escape route she considered viable. She sprinted into the detached four-car garage, her bare feet slapping against the cold concrete floor. She was aiming for Preston's pride and joy, a silver sports car that he kept polished and fueled for weekend drives. She threw herself into the driver's seat and hammered the push-to-start button. Nothing happened. The engine did not roar to life. The dashboard remained dark. She pressed it again, harder this time, screaming in frustration. She did not know that I had called the dealership yesterday afternoon and had the digital key codes reset remotely. The car was nothing more than a piece of 2-ton metal sculpture. She looked up through the windshield to see two figures standing in the open garage doorway. It was Dr. Eris Thorne and Lucas DeRossi. They were not there to stop her physically. They were there to document her fall. Both men held their phones up, recording every second of her meltdown. Sienna began to beat her fists against the leather steering wheel, shrieking like a banshee, destroying the interior of a car she would never drive. Her tantrum ended abruptly when 4 uniformed officers swarmed the garage. They dragged her out of the low bucket seat. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, her demeanor shifted instantly from rage to cowardice. She started shouting that she was innocent, that she was just an employee, and that Preston Vance was the mastermind behind the entire operation. She screamed that he had forced her to do it, throwing the man she had seduced under the bus without a second of hesitation. Inside the main house, the scene was even more pathetic. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, looking down into the foyer. The party was over. The music had been replaced by the crackle of police radios. Preston was on his knees on the marble floor, his hands cuffed behind his back. The tuxedo he had worn to impress his new world was rumpled and stained. He was surrounded by the very investors he had tried to swindle. He was frantically trying to explain himself to a federal agent. He kept insisting that he was a victim, that Sienna had tricked him just like she tricked everyone else. He claimed he had no idea the fund was fake. The agent listened impassively, then pulled a plastic evidence bag from his jacket pocket. Inside was the tracing paper with my forged signature. The agent told Preston that while he might be a victim of Sienna's fraud, he was the sole perpetrator of the bank fraud and forgery regarding the house. That was a separate crime, and he had signed his own confession on tape. Preston slumped forward, the fight draining out of him. Then he looked up and saw me standing on the landing. For a moment, his eyes lit up with a desperate, delusional hope. He called out my name. He begged me to help him. He asked me to tell the officers that I had given him permission to sign the papers. He looked at me with tears streaming down his face and said that he was my husband and that family should protect each other. The room went silent. The investors, the police, and the staff all turned to look at me. I descended one step, just enough to be seen clearly by everyone, but I kept my distance. I looked at the man who had humiliated me publicly less than 2 days ago. I felt absolutely nothing, no anger, no sadness, just a cold sense of closure. I spoke clearly so the cameras could pick up every word. I told him that my husband had died the moment he threw divorce papers at me on a live stream. I told him that the man kneeling on the floor was a stranger to me. I said that he was no longer a husband, he was just a defendant. Preston bowed his head, finally accepting his defeat. Around him, a dozen smartphones were held aloft. The guests, the people he had invited to witness his ascent, were now live streaming his arrest to the world. The comments were scrolling by in real time, mocking him, judging him, and stripping away the last shreds of his dignity. He had tried to use social media to destroy me, and now it was recording his total and permanent collapse. It has been 6 months since the night the police lights illuminated the driveway of Blackwood Manor. Yesterday, the final gavel fell in the courtroom, bringing an end to the legal storm that Preston invited into our lives. Sarah Miller, the woman who called herself Sienna Cross, was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for grand larceny and identity theft. The judge showed no mercy for the way she systematically destroyed lives for her own gain. Preston did not escape unscathed. He was sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security facility for financial fraud and forgery. Beyond the prison time, the real punishment for a man like Preston was the total erasure of his status. His real estate license has been permanently revoked. He has lost his career, his reputation, and his freedom. He is now exactly what he feared most, which is a nobody with a criminal record. My divorce was finalized this morning. Thanks to the ironclad stipulations of the Blackwood Heritage Preservation Trust and the overwhelming evidence of his infidelity and attempted fraud, Preston left this marriage with absolutely nothing. He did not get a settlement, he did not get alimony, and he certainly did not get the house. Tonight, the manor is full of guests again, but the atmosphere is entirely different. I am hosting an art exhibition and charity gala to raise funds for victims of financial scams. The walls that were once covered in cheap white sheets are now proudly displaying the Blackwood collection again. Dr. Eris Thorne and Lucas DeRossi are standing by the fireplace, laughing together. We have become close friends over these past few months, bonded by the trauma we survived and the victory we claimed. We raised our glasses in a toast, not to wealth, but to freedom. I paused for a moment in front of the oil portrait of my grandmother hanging in the east hallway. I silently thanked her for her wisdom. She had foreseen that the family legacy needed protection not just from time, but from the greed of others. Her foresight in creating the trust had saved everything she worked for. Later that evening, I changed the security codes to the main gates for the final time. The mail arrived earlier, and among the bills was a letter with a return address from the state correctional facility. It was from Preston. I could see his handwriting was shaky. I scanned the first few lines where he begged for forgiveness and asked for a second chance. I did not feel a spark of anger or pity. I simply walked over to the fireplace and tossed the unopened letter into the flames. I watched the paper curl and turn to ash, taking the last remnant of my marriage with it. I stepped out onto the balcony, the cool night air filling my lungs. Below me, the garden had been restored to its original design, stripping away the minimalist aesthetic Preston had forced upon it. I breathed in deeply, feeling a profound sense of peace. I did not need a husband to define my worth, and I did not need a partner to validate my ownership of this home. I was standing on my own ground, stronger than I had ever been. True value is not found in what you own, but in how you protect yourself against those who want to take it from you. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to hear from you, so please leave a comment down below telling me where you are listening from today so we can share our thoughts together. Please do not forget to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and support us further by hitting the hype button so this story can reach even more people.